time, in its indifferent tide, swept away the echoes of a world that was dying. It was the year of 1452. In the distance, over the Bosporus, the ancient walls of Constantinople held their breath, awaiting the final assault that would forever change the map of power. But here, in the heart of Tuscany, among hills that undulated like a sea of olive trees and vineyards, history was being written in whispers. In the small village of Vinci, clinging to the stone like moss, the air smelled of damp earth and cypress. The silence of the fields was only broken by the murmur of a stream or the distant echo of a bell. In this corner of the world, oblivious to the great dramas of empires and popes, a child was born in the third hour of the night on a Saturday, the 15th of April. There were no omens in the sky, nor comets to announce his arrival. Only the tranquil light of the Tuscan moon bathing the terracotta rooftops. His father was a man of his time, Ser Piero Fruosino di Antonio da Vinci, a Florentine notary, a weaver of contracts and lineages, whose pen shaped inheritances and alliances. A man of the city, of laws and order, whose life was altered by a fleeting passion in the countryside. His mother was a whisper, a shadow in the official records. Her name was Caterina, a young peasant woman from the village, whose only tangible legacy to history would be the son she conceived outside of wedlock. Her face, her fears, her hopes, all have been lost, dissolved like morning mist in the valleys of the Arno. She was the origin, the fertile land, but history, written by men like Ser Piero, barely paused to record her name. The child was named Leonardo, a name without the weight of a legitimate family surname, a subtle mark of his condition. He was not a repudiated bastard, for his father acknowledged him and provided for him. But he was also not the heir who would continue the lineage of notaries. That door, the one of social prestige and liberal professions, closed for him at the very moment of his birth. And in that closure, paradoxically, resided his freedom. He was not bound to follow his father's path. He was not destined to spend his days deciphering the fine print of wills. His path was blank, like a page yet to be written. He did not grow up in bustling Florence, amid the noise of guilds and the intrigues of the Medici. His early years were spent there, in Vinci, in the house of his paternal grandparents. His world was not that of accounting books, but of the flight of birds, the anatomy of a dragonfly, the way light refracts when passing through a glass of water. While other children learned Latin, he learned the language of the wind and the olive trees. While others memorized genealogies, he observed how the roots of a tree clung to the rock. His grandfather, Antonio, recorded him in his register with the brevity of a man of the field. A grandson of mine was born, son of Ser Piero, my son. A simple acknowledgement of a fact. No one could imagine that those small hands, which then barely grasped a finger, would one day draw the hidden muscles beneath the skin, design flying machines, and paint the most enigmatic smile in the history of art. No one could know that his mind, nourished by silence and solitary observation, would become a universe in itself. The child grew between two worlds, the one of the earth, tangible and real, that he walked on every day, and the distant world of his father, a figure of authority and success in faraway Florence. He was a son of the law and a son of the field, a duality that would mark his entire existence. The stain of his birth, instead of being a burden, became the fertile ground where an insatiable curiosity germinated. And so, while Christendom trembled and the Renaissance flourished in the cities, a child walked through the hills of Vinci, with his gaze lost in the clouds. His education was not in classrooms, but in the great open book of nature. The echo of the blacksmith's hammer in the valley would soon be replaced by the sound of chisels and the debates of Florence, but the memory of that first light, of that primordial silence, would never leave him. The echo of the hills of Vinci faded with each step that took him away from his childhood. The smell of damp earth and olives was replaced by the breath of stone, and the incessant murmur of a city that was, in itself, a work of art and a machine of ambition. Florence. In the middle of the 15th century, it was not just a place on the map, but the epicenter of a tremor that shook the foundations of the medieval world. Its light, filtered through the dust of the workshops and reflected in the waters of the Arno, seemed to tint the air with a golden promise. And to this whirlwind of genius and commerce came a 14-year-old boy, brought by a notary father who had recognized in his illegitimate son's drawings not only talent, but also an opportunity. A lineage that could not inherit titles, but perhaps forge a name in metal and color. Leonardo's destiny was the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Entering that studio was not like entering a school, but rather the beating heart of creation. The air vibrated with the clamor of the hammer on bronze, the hissing of molten metal, the scraping of chisels on marble. It smelled of turpentine, hot wax, ground pigments whose chemistry was a closely guarded secret, and that scent of wet earth from the clay waiting for form on the lathe. It was a universe of feverish labor, where young apprentices, covered in dust and paint stains, learned a craft that was, at once, art, science, and alchemy. Verrocchio was not a mere painter. He was a master of form in all its manifestations. His hands, rough and skilled, could both shape the delicate filigree of a gold brooch and design the colossal machines necessary to raise the copper sphere above Brunelleschi's dome. He was a man of his time, practical, demanding, and with an infallible eye for talent. He saw in the young Leonardo not only a skilled hand, but an inquisitive mind, a gaze that did not stop at the surface of things, but sought the structure that held them, the nerve beneath the skin, the invisible current that stirred a fabric. The apprenticeship was a slow ritual of imitation and service. Leonardo began, like everyone, grinding colors into a fine powder, preparing boards with layers of plaster, sweeping the floor covered in wood shavings and stone chips. But his eyes absorbed everything. He learned the chemistry of oils and temperas, the physics of lost wax casting, the geometry hidden in perspective, the botany necessary to accurately draw the acanthus leaves on a capital. He studied anatomy not only in books, but in the bodies of the workshop workers, observing the tension of a muscle when lifting a weight, the fatigue in the curve of a back. Legend has it that in those early years, his father commissioned him to decorate a wooden shield for a peasant. Leonardo, instead of painting a traditional coat of arms, locked himself in his room and, gathering lizards, crickets, snakes, and bats, studied their forms to compose a monster so terrifically alive that, it is said, his own father recoiled in fear upon seeing it. It was already a sign of his method, direct observation of nature, in its beauty and in its horror, to distill a reality more intense than reality itself. But the moment that sealed his transition from apprentice to master came silently in a corner of someone else's canvas. Verrocchio was working on one of his great commissions, the baptism of Christ. He already trusted his disciple enough to assign him to paint one of the secondary figures, a kneeling angel holding Jesus' garments. When Leonardo finished, something extraordinary had occurred on the canvas. Next to the solid and slightly stiff figures of the master, his angel seemed to breathe. Painted with a new technique, the sfumato, its contours dissolved softly into the air, its hair was a cascade of golden light, and its face bore a sweet, almost human melancholy. It was not a divine creature carved in paint. It was a being of light and thought. Tradition holds, perhaps with the poetic exaggeration of time, that upon seeing his pupil's work, Andrea del Verrocchio, feeling the cold echo of a future that no longer belonged to him, decided never to take up a brush again. The apprenticeship had ended. In the Florentine crucible, under the watchful eye of his master, the young man from Vinci had not only learned to master color and line, he had learned to ask questions. The tools of art were becoming, in his hands, instruments to interrogate the world. The angel was just the beginning. Now his gaze would rise from the canvas to the flight of birds, to the flow of water, to the intricate mechanism of the human body itself. Fame began to whisper his name through the cobblestone streets of Florence, a silent prelude to the tide that was about to unleash. The echo of the hammer on the bronze faded into memory, replaced by the silence of a personal studio. Leonardo was no longer the boy from Vinci, the promise of Verrocchio's workshop. He was Master Leonardo, a name that began to float in the dense air of Florence, a city that measured its men by the beauty they could create, or by the gold they could amass. The Arno continued its indifferent course, reflecting a sky that had seen generations of artists born and die, and now observed this young man in his 20s, whose gaze seemed to contain the stillness of a deep lake and the agitation of a distant storm. His first studio was a modest space, imbued with the smell of pigment and linseed oil, a sanctuary where light entered, filtered through suspended dust. There, Leonardo ceased to be the disciple perfecting another's angel. He began his own dialogue with the canvas, a dialogue that was often more of a question than an affirmation. In his Annunciation, painted in those years of emerging independence, the seed of his revolution can already be perceived. The light is not divine, but morning, a real light that bathes the garden and glides over the marble of the lectern. The angel's wings are not of faith, but of anatomy, studied, plausible, each feather an exercise in observing the flight of the birds that fascinated him so much. It is a sacred scene, treated with the curiosity of a naturalist, a foreshadowing of the fusion between science and soul that would define his entire existence. His fame grew, not like a wildfire, but like the humidity that climbs an ancient wall, slow, persistent, inevitable. Commissions came to him, portraits like that of Ginevra de Benci, a pale and solemn young woman surrounded by a hedge of juniper. Leonardo did not settle for capturing her likeness. He sought the landscape of her spirit. He painted her against a watery and misty background, an atmosphere that seems to emanate from the very melancholy of the portrayed. The soul of the young woman, her virtus, peeks out with the shyness of a winter flower, and in her face, that softening technique, that technique of blurred contours that dissolves matter into the air, is already being rehearsed, like a memory that refuses to be completely clear. But it was in 1481, with the commission for the Adoration of the Magi for the monks of San Donato a Scopeto, when Florence first faced the abyss of Leonardo's mind. The panel he began to paint was not a pious scene, it was the map of a spiritual cataclysm. In the center, the Virgin and Child radiate a supernatural calm, a hurricane's eye around which a whirlwind of human and equine figures swirls, faces contorted by doubt, wonder, revelation, horses rearing in an almost mythological fury. In the background, crumbling architectures and battles that seem to speak of the fall of the old pagan world. Leonardo worked with feverish intensity, drawing directly on the panel with quick, almost violent strokes. But the canvas could not contain the tide of his thoughts. Each figure opened a new line of inquiry, each gesture a new question about human psychology. And then, the work came to a halt. The piece remained suspended, like a held breath. A monochromatic sketch of an idea too vast to be completed. The monks waited. Florence, a city of finished works and fulfilled contracts, did not know what to do with a genius who offered the sketch of the universe and not the polished image of a saint. His reputation became dual. He was the most talented artist of his time, but also the most inconsistent. A man whose mind traveled so far that he often left his own body behind, brush in hand, before an unfinished canvas. Perhaps it was in the silence of that failure, in the contemplation of that magnificent and incomplete work, where Leonardo understood that the walls of Florence, with its guilds and narrow-minded patrons, were becoming a cage for his limitless curiosity. The air of Tuscany, which had nourished his youth, began to feel scarce. His gaze, tired of the faces of merchants and bankers, began to turn north, towards the mists of Lombardy, where power was not only displayed in art, but forged with iron and strategy. The air of Florence, which once held the promise of the world, was beginning to feel worn for a soul like his. The golden light that spilled over the Arno and Brunelleschi's domes no longer illuminated new paths for Leonardo. He had drunk from its fountains, learned the language of line and color in its workshops, but his thirst was that of an ocean, and Florence had become a familiar pond. At 30 years of age, he felt the weight not of age, but of a horizon that refused to expand. The tide of his genius needed a broader shore against which to break. And so, in 1482, he turned his gaze northward, toward the misty Lombardy and its cities of power. He left behind the republic of merchants and philosophers for the Duchy of Milan, a realm forged in ambition and steel. The journey itself was a transition, a slow shedding of the Tuscan warmth. The sharp cypress trees gave way to flooded plains and a paler, more uncertain sky. Milan was not Florence. Its beauty did not reside in sun-polished marble, but in somber stone and the echo of iron. It was a city of soldiers, of court intrigues, ruled with a firm hand by a man as complex and opaque as the fog that often enveloped his castle. That man was Ludovico Sforza, known as the Moor, for the color of his skin, or perhaps for the darkness of his ambitions. He was not the legitimate duke, but the regent of his young nephew, a borrowed power that he defended with a mix of cunning, cruelty, and a dazzling display of magnificence. Ludovico understood power as a theatre. He knew that to govern, strength alone was not enough. Wonder was needed, the spectacle that left rivals and subjects breathless. And in Leonardo, he saw more than a painter, he saw a master of marvel. It is said that Leonardo presented himself to him not with a brush, but with a letter that is in itself a portrait of his vast and pragmatic mind. In 10 detailed points, he offered his services to Sforza. 9 of them described his skills as a military engineer, the design of light and indestructible bridges, the ability to divert rivers to besiege fortresses, the creation of covered and impregnable carts, the development of mortars that launched a rain of stones and silent catapults. He spoke of war with the precision of an anatomist and the coldness of a winter frost. And almost as an afterthought, at the end of the long list of death and defense artifacts, in the 10th point, he mentioned that in times of peace, he could also fully satisfy an architecture, and that in painting and sculpture, he could do anything as well as anyone else, whoever they might be. Ludovico, a man who lived under the constant shadow of betrayal and war, must have read those lines with growing interest. This Florentine was not an ethereal artist. He was a practical man who understood the language of power. He offered him a place at his court, and thus began one of the most fertile and, at the same time, strangest periods of Leonardo's life. He became the architect of the ephemeral. He designed costumes and stage machinery for the sumptuous festivities of the castle, created automatons that astonished ambassadors, organized tournaments and spectacles whose memory would fade like smoke. His genius, capable of conceiving flying machines and unraveling the secrets of the human body, was put to the service of the pomp and vanity of a court. But even amid that whirlwind of silk and music, his mind never rested. While the court applauded a mechanical lion that walked and opened its chest to reveal a bouquet of lilies, Leonardo's mind was mapping the hidden muscles beneath the skin of a horse, or calculating the flow of water in the canals of Lombardy. He was both the servant of a prince and the lord of an unexplored inner universe. He received a salary, yes, but the true payment was the time and space for his secret investigations. In Ludovico's court, the painter became an engineer, the engineer a musician, the musician a scientist. The walls of his workshop in Milan filled with sketches of weapons alongside studies of flowers, designs for a dome alongside the delicate anatomy of an eyelid. And in the silence of his studio, far from the murmur of courtiers and the weight of silk, the true work continued. The question that had followed him since the fields of Vinci returned with the force of a nocturnal tide. What is the measure of man? On a parchment, in the light of a candle that flickered like a solitary star, he would begin to trace the answer in a circle and a square. The fog of the Lombard winters clung to the stones of the Castello Sforzesco, a damp veil that silenced the footsteps of the guards and the murmur of ambitions in the court of Milan. Within those walls, Leonardo was no longer just the painter of Florence. He was the duke's engineer, the musician, the organizer of ephemeral spectacles that burned for one night and left only a memory of ash and wonder. His mind, an incessant tide, moved between war projects and plans to channel rivers, but in the silence of his studio, by the flickering light of a candle, he always returned to the fundamental question, the one that pulsed beneath all the others. What is the measure of man? In those years, among the echoes of stone and the chill of marble, an ancient lineage of thought came into his hands. It was a text, almost a ghost, from a Roman architect named Vitruvius, a voice that had crossed 1,500 years of silence, to whisper an idea of almost divine symmetry, that a man with arms and legs extended could be perfectly inscribed within the two purest and most absolute forms known to the mind. The circle, symbol of the celestial and the infinite, and the square, emblem of the earthly and the measurable. Others before him had tried, drawing rigid figures, almost prisoners of geometry. But Leonardo did not read Vitruvius as a submissive disciple, but as an interlocutor. He felt that the ancient text did not always fit with living flesh, with the pulse he felt in his own wrist, with the bodies he had observed in the streets and secretly dissected. The man of Vitruvius was an idea. Leonardo wanted to give it a body. Thus, on a sheet of paper that today seems as fragile as the wing of a moth, he began his work. It was not a burst of inspiration, but a deep meditation, an act of balance between the compass and the eye. With oak gall ink, he first traced the circle, then the square, and within, he did not draw a man, but the movement of a man. Two figures superimposed in a single body. One, with arms crossed and feet together, fits into the square, firm upon the earth. The other, opening arms and legs in a gesture of expansion, touches the circumference of the circle, brushing against the cosmos. The face of that man shows no effort. His gaze is serene, almost indifferent to the mathematical feat that his own body demonstrates. He is not posing. He is being. He is the microcosm, the small universe that contains within itself all the laws of the great. Leonardo, with the patience of a geologist, noted the proportions around him in his characteristic mirror writing. The foot is 1/4 of the height. The palm is the width of 4 fingers. The navel is the natural center of the body, the immobile point around which the universe of flesh revolves. This drawing was not conceived to be a work of art hung in a salon. It was a private investigation, a page torn from a notebook of thoughts. It was a silent dialogue between him and the universe, a confirmation that beauty was not an accident, but the result of an underlying mathematical order, a harmony that connected the farthest star with the finest vein of a leaf. Man was no longer a prisoner of geometry. He was its measure, its center, and its reason for being. On that simple sheet of paper, Leonardo reconciled the soul with science, philosophy with anatomy. It was a moment of calm, of perfect balance found in the solitude of his studio, a truth distilled in ink and paper. But harmony, like the light of a candle, is fragile. That very hand, which had traced the ideal perfection of the body, would soon confront the disorder of the human soul, the agitation of doubt, and the weight of betrayal. The calm of the circle and the square was about to be shattered by the echo of a dinner in Jerusalem, where 12 men would sit at a table and the order of the world would change forever. After having enclosed the cosmos within the circle and the square, after having measured the divine proportion in the flesh of man, Leonardo's gaze turned from the parchment to the stone. Duke Ludovico Sforza, Lord of Milan, commissioned him a wall. Not a canvas, but a cold wall in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the place where the Dominican monks took their frugal meals in silence. On that bare wall, swept by the pale light of Lombardy, one of the most sacred and terrible scenes of Christianity was to be born. The commission was clear, the Last Supper. But the question resonating in Leonardo's restless mind was infinitely more complex. How to paint the echo of a word? How to capture on a wall the exact moment when a phrase, "One of you will betray me," shatters in the air and unleashes a tide of human emotions. He did not want to paint 13 static figures like Byzantine icons. He wanted to paint the soul. And here, Leonardo rebelled against the lineage of the centuries. He rejected the fresco buono, the venerable technique of painting on wet plaster, which demanded a quick and sure execution. The fresco is packed with haste. It knows no doubt. It allows no regret. And Leonardo was a man of doubts, of infinite and tortuous deliberation. He needed time to think, to correct, to add a veil of light or a shadow of sorrow. So, in his boldness, he experimented. On the dry wall, he applied a base of plaster, pitch, and mastic, and on it painted with tempera and oil, as if it were a panel. An innovation born of his temperament, a wager against time. The work began in 1495, but it was not a task of constant brushstrokes. The monks saw the master ascend the scaffolding and remain hours motionless, with his arms crossed, simply gazing at the blank wall. At other times, he would make a single brushstroke and leave. The prior of the convent, impatient, complained to Sforza about the artist's exasperating pace. It is said that Leonardo, with a sharp calm, replied that if he continued to pressure him, he would use his face as a model for Judas. For that was his quest. He wandered the streets of Milan, through its taverns and markets, scrutinizing the faces of common people. He sought anger in a gesture, innocence in a gaze, betrayal in the curve of a mouth. He filled his notebooks with studies of clenched hands, hunched shoulders, and furrowed brows. Each apostle had to be an individual, a distinct psychological whirlwind. He grouped them in threes, creating waves of reaction that spread from the silent epicenter of Christ, whose serene figure is the only point of stillness in the tempest. After nearly 3 years of pauses, reflections, and meticulous labor, the work was completed. What appeared on that wall was not a painting. It was a window into a frozen moment of human and divine history. The perspective, masterful, made the painted room seem an extension of the refectory itself, and the light of the scene seemed to emanate from the real window on the left. Every detail, from the fold of a tablecloth to the spilled salt from a retreating Judas, was laden with meaning. The world was amazed, but tragedy, like dark moss, was already growing on the stone. Leonardo's innovation was his condemnation. The moisture of the wall began to attack his delicate emulsion of tempera and oil. Barely 2 decades after its completion, the pigments were already beginning to flake off. The masterpiece carried within its very skin the seed of its own ashes, a melancholic echo about the fragility of beauty and the struggle of genius against matter. Leonardo had captured an eternal moment, but eternity refused to dwell in his creation. As the pigments began their slow return to dust, Leonardo's mind was already elsewhere, calculating the weight of iron and the force of water, designing machines for flight or for war. The wall was fading, but the drive to master the laws of the physical world, to shape matter in even more lasting ways, grew stronger within him. The echo of the last brushes on the wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie had not yet faded, and the humidity of the plaster still permeated the air of the refectory with a scent of earth and eternity. There, in the silence of the shared dinner, Leonardo had halted time. But outside that gathering, in the streets of Milan, time accelerated with the cadence of iron and intrigue. Peace was a luxury that the Duchy of Ludovico Sforza could not afford for long. The milky fog rising from the fields of Lombardy seemed to bring with it not only the cold of winter, but also the murmur of distant armies and the clinking of French ambitions. Ludovico, the Moor, was a man who understood power not only as a display of art and culture, but also as a fortress of thick walls and arranged cannons. He looked at Leonardo, his court painter, and saw beyond the artist. He saw the mind that had unraveled perspective, the same one that, years earlier, had written him a bold letter, a promise of war machines that seemed drawn from a dark fantasy. Now, the Duke needed those fantasies to become stone and metal. And so, the mind of Leonardo, which had just dwelled in the serene sadness of the apostles, turned towards the cold logic of destruction. His notebooks, once filled with studies of hands in prayer and faces in ecstasy, began to populate with designs that breathed calculated violence. He sketched covered carts, bristling with scythes, intended to reap the legs of enemy infantry as if they were ears of grain in a field of macabre harvest. He conceived an armoured vehicle, a shell of wood and metal powered by the strength of 8 men inside, a war turtle capable of advancing under a rain of arrows, spewing fire through its embrasures. It was the ancestor of a terror that would take 400 years to be born. These machines, however, were often the ashes of dreams too advanced for their time. Their construction required a precision and resources that 15th century Milan could barely conceive. They were poems of engineering, perfect on paper, but silent on the battlefield. More practical, and therefore more real, were his designs for portable bridges, light and sturdy, that could be assembled and disassembled with a speed that would disorient any enemy. He studied the trajectory of projectiles, the force needed to bring down a wall, the tension of the string of a giant crossbow whose size would have made a cyclops tremble. In his mind, war was not just fury and chaos. It was a symphony of levers, angles, and forces. A deadly dance governed by the same laws that ruled the fall of an apple or the flow of a river. But the same mind that designed annihilation also longed for order and creation. Leonardo's genius knew no boundaries between the civil and the military. His gaze settled on the waters that wound through the Lombard plains. He saw in them not only a defense but also a source of life and commerce. For Ludovico, he designed a complex system of canals and locks that would transform the region. His invention of the double-gate lock allowed vessels to overcome elevation changes with astonishing ease, as if the water itself obeyed his will. The liquid element, which he had studied so many times in its eddies and currents, became a docile servant, transporting goods and irrigating fields that had once been barren. It was a silent victory, a bloodless conquest that would nourish generations. Thus passed his days in Milan, in a duality that defined his spirit. In the morning, he might be calculating the power of a mortar. In the afternoon, designing an ideal city with streets on 2 levels to separate vehicular traffic from pedestrians, a dream of urban harmony against the disorder of the world. The same hand that drew death also traced the map of a cleaner and more orderly future. Deep down, for Leonardo, everything was part of the same vast study: movement. The movement of a gear, of a planet, of a current of water. And as he observed the levers and pulleys of his machines, as he felt the effort of the muscles that would move them, his insatiable curiosity began to turn towards a new territory, one more intimate and mysterious. He began to see in the bodies of men and animals the most sublime of all machines. A structure of tendons like strings, bones like levers, and muscles like engines. The engineering of war and water was unknowingly opening the door to the lineage of flesh and bone. War machines and waterworks, with their skeletons of wood and iron, began to seem simple to him. The same pulse that had driven him to unravel the gears of a clock or the trajectory of a projectile now pushed him toward the deepest and closest mystery, the machinery of the human body. In the silence of Milanese nights, under the flickering light of a candle that stretched shadows into ghosts, Leonardo da Vinci ventured into forbidden territory, a place where science and sacrilege shook hands. The Ospedale Maggiore of Milan, with its long corridors of cold stone, became his secret laboratory. There, far from the pomp of the court of Ludovico Sforza, the bodies of the dispossessed, of executed criminals, of those whose lineage had extinguished in solitude arrived. They were the raw material of his research, with a calm that belied the danger of his actions, for dissection was a practice that bordered on heresy and provoked deep social repulsion. Leonardo wielded the scalpel not as a butcher, but as a cartographer of the invisible. It was not the curiosity of a desecrator, but the reverence of an architect before the supreme work. The human body was for him the ultimate cathedral, and each incision a way to read its sacred blueprints. His hands, the same ones that had given life to the smile of an angel on canvas, now stained with ink and the very essence of life and death. The skin opened. The fat, yellow and strange, gave way to the deep red of muscle. And there, beneath his fingers, was the design. He understood that the tendons were nothing but the strings that moved the pulleys of the joints, and that the heart was not the seat of the soul, as poets believed, but a four-chambered pump, a perfect and resilient hydraulic engineering work. His notebooks filled with images of terrible and precise beauty. He drew the bronchial tree like the branches of an oak in winter. He traced the labyrinth of blood vessels with the same patience with which a monk illuminates a manuscript. And in one of his most moving pages, he drew a fetus curled up in the womb, floating in its liquid universe, an image of such tenderness and scientific precision that even today it leaves us breathless. It was not just a drawing, it was a meditation on origin, on the echo of our own existence before the first breath of air. Throughout his life, it is said that he dissected more than 30 bodies of men, women, and animals, always seeking the universal law that governed form and function. This secret knowledge nourished his art in a profound way. When he painted a bent arm, he felt the contracted biceps beneath the skin. When he drew anguish on a face, he saw the complex dance of the small facial muscles he had traced in the light of a candle. His figures ceased to be mere representations and became presences, bodies with weight, blood, and a hidden skeleton that granted them an unbreakable truth. But this vast ocean of knowledge became dammed. His notebooks, filled with wisdom that was centuries ahead of his time, closed like sealed tombs after his death. And the tide of anatomical knowledge had to wait for other men, for other centuries, to rise again. The tragedy of Leonardo was not ignorance, but the silence that followed his discovery. Meanwhile, outside those cold and silent rooms, the world did not stop. The thunder of the French armies approaching Milan was the brutal counterpoint to the silent heartbeat that Leonardo had sought in the chest of the dead. The flame of the candle danced, casting its shadow over drawings of wings and hearts, while the winter of the power of the Sforza loomed over the city. The time of stillness and study was coming to an end. It was time to walk again. The winter of 1499 arrived in Milan, not only with frost, but with the echo of French boots on the stone of the streets. The court of Ludovico Sforza, that brilliant and fragile microcosm of art and power, crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide of war. And with it, the world that Leonardo had inhabited for nearly 2 decades disintegrated. The salons where music and philosophical debate resonated fell silent, covered by the dust of conquest. The great equestrian sculpture, the dream of bronze that never was now just a ghost in an abandoned courtyard, a memory of clay waiting to be dissolved by rain and the indifference of the new masters. From the ashes of Milan emerged a man of nearly 50 years, whose beard was already beginning to turn silver. A man who packed not only brushes and pigments, but the weight of a shattered court and the uncertainty of a pilgrim. Leonardo da Vinci, the renowned master, was once again a traveler without a fixed destination. After a brief stay in Mantua and Venice, where his fame preceded him like a silent herald, his steps, almost by inertia, led him back to his origins. In the spring of the year 1500, he saw again the hills surrounding Florence, the city of his youth. But the Florence to which he returned was not the same as the one he had left. The lineage of the Medici had fallen. The bonfire of Savonarola had burned and extinguished, and now a nervous and proud republic was trying to find its balance. Leonardo was no longer the young apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop, but a living legend, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and mystery. He stayed with the Servite monks at the convent of the Most Holy Annunciation, and it was there that the city could once again glimpse the depth of his genius. He was commissioned to create an altarpiece, and he, instead of rushing into painting, dedicated months to conception, to preparatory drawing. He created a cartoon, a vast study in charcoal and white chalk of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. When he finally displayed it in his quarters, something unusual happened. It is said that for 2 days, the entire city, from the artisan to the noble, paraded in an almost liturgical silence before that paper. It was not only the perfection of the forms or the tenderness of the gazes that captivated them. It was life itself, breathing beneath the charcoal dust. In those intertwined figures, they saw not only the saint and the virgin, but the soul of a man who had returned from exile to show them something they had forgotten. Beauty as a refuge against the chaos of the world. However, the artist who moved the crowds was also the solitary man whose notebooks filled with other obsessions. While Florence admired his art, he climbed the hills to study the flight of the kites, filling page after page with analyses of the wind and the mechanics of wings. His mind was a river that could not be contained by the banks of a single craft. He even accepted for a time the service of Cesare Borgia, the feared son of the Pope, becoming his architect and military engineer. He traveled through Romagna, mapping territories with an unprecedented precision, designing fortifications and channeling rivers. The same hand that drew the smile of a virgin now traced the cold lines of war and power. It was a strange dance between creation and destruction, a duality that resided in the very heart of his being. The return to Florence was not an ending, but a crossroads. It brought him back to his land, but it also confirmed his condition as an eternal foreigner, a man whose homeland was knowledge itself. The city offered him commissions, rivalries, and admiration, but his gaze was already drifting beyond the walls, following the course of the Arno toward the sea, or the flight of a bird toward the sky. And it was there, among studies of hydraulics and sketches for a great battle, that a face began to take shape in his mind, and then on a panel of poplar, a face that was neither saint nor virgin, but that of a Florentine woman, a smile that he would keep to himself, like a secret whispered to eternity. The echo of his steps on the Florentine stone was no longer that of a young man yearning for a future, but that of a man burdened by the weight of many pasts. Florence, upon his return at the dawn of the new century, welcomed him like an illustrious ghost, a legend returning home. But time, that relentless tide, had eroded the landscape of his youth. New names, new ambitions filled the dense air of the workshops. And it was in this autumn of his life, amidst a world that was no longer entirely his, that Leonardo began the work that would become the silent testament of his art. It was not a papal commission, nor the whim of a duke. It was a modest request, almost mundane. A silk merchant, Francesco del Giocondo, desired a portrait of his young wife, Lisa Gherardini, perhaps to celebrate the birth of a child or the purchase of a new house. A bourgeois gesture, a longing to endure on canvas as one endures in lineage. For Leonardo, who had mapped rivers and designed war machines, the task might have seemed minor. But he did not see a simple woman. He saw the universe contained in a face. Thus began the long sessions in his studio. The light of Tuscany filtered through the windows fell upon her, a soft light that seemed more a memory than a presence. It is said that Leonardo hired musicians and jesters so that the stillness of the pose would not freeze her spirit, so that something of ephemeral life, a melody, a joke, could peek into her eyes. He did not seek the pose, but the inner tide, the moti dell'anima, the movements of the soul that he had spent decades studying in corpses and in living faces. He did not paint the skin, but what breathed beneath it. To achieve this, he employed a technique that he had perfected until it became breath, the sfumato. There are no hard lines in the Gioconda. The contours do not end. They fade into the air, like the smoke that gives it its name or the edge of a dream upon waking. He applied glazes, the thinnest and most translucent layers of oil, one over another for months, perhaps years. With the patience of a geologist observing the slow formation of stone, Leonardo built the flesh, the light, and the shadow. The corners of the lips and the outer corners of the eyes are pure twilight, an uncertain territory where joy merges with melancholy. And therein lies the mystery that has enchanted the centuries, the smile. It is not a smile, in reality. It is the moment before or after it. It is the threshold between a thought and its silence. It is a private knowledge that is offered to us and denied to us in the same blink. As we observe it, it seems to change, as if responding to our own doubts. Leonardo did not paint an emotion, but the human capacity to feel them all at once. Behind her, the landscape is equally enigmatic. It is not the Tuscan countryside. It is a primordial, dreamlike world of rocks eroded by impossible waters and bridges that lead nowhere. A landscape of geological memory, where the human time of Lisa Gherardini contrasts with the cosmic time of nature. It is as if Leonardo were telling us that each individual is a precarious moment against the eternity of stone and water. Francesco del Giocondo never received his portrait. Leonardo, in an act of unprecedented artistic possession, refused to deliver it. The work became his traveling companion, his silent interlocutor. He took it with him to Rome, across the Alps, to his final refuge in France. He continued to add brushstrokes, seeking that unattainable perfection, chasing an echo in the face of a woman who had already faded into time. The portrait of Lisa had become the portrait of the soul itself, a mirror in which Leonardo saw reflected his own questions about life, death, and the incessant flow of all things. But while Leonardo lost himself in the glazes of his Lisa, another pulse, younger and more violent, began to beat in the heart of Florence. A pulse of marble and fury. A name resonated in the workshops and squares, that of an artist who did not whisper with shadows, but shouted with the force of the chisel. A name that would soon cross paths with the old master like an inevitable storm. Buonarroti. As the enigmatic veil of Lisa Gherardini settled over the canvas, a new echo resonated in the streets of Florence. It was an echo distinct from the murmur of the workshops or the song of the guilds. It was the sound of two titans who, without seeking it, measured their shadows under the same Tuscan sun. The air of the city, which had witnessed the birth of Leonardo, was now charged with the tension of a new lineage of genius, one younger, fiercer, forged not in the delicacy of sfumato, but in the brutal strike of the chisel against the marble. Florence, having shaken off the ashes of Savonarola's fanaticism, longed to immortalize its renewed republican glory. And what better stage than the heart of its power, the Palazzo Vecchio? In the vast hall of the 500, a space that seemed to hold the breath of history, the Signoria conceived a monumental duel. Not a duel of swords, but of brushes, a confrontation that would put face to face the two greatest artists of their time. On one side, Leonardo, already in his 50s, a worldly man with courtly manners and a universal mind, whose fame was a soft and persistent melody. On the other, 23 years younger, Michelangelo Buonarroti, a tormented and solitary soul, a sculptor who felt the pulse of life trapped in stone. His recent David, a feat of marble and defiance, already stood as the symbol of the new Florence, young and challenging. They were the sunset and the midday, reflective wisdom and impetuous strength. Leonardo was commissioned to depict the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory that he was to capture in a whirlwind of fury and movement. He, who had written about the bestialissima pazzia of war, immersed himself in the creation of a vortex of rearing horses, of faces distorted by screams, of steel against steel. His preparatory cartoon was a masterclass on the anatomy of violence, chaos organized into a sublime composition. Michelangelo, on the opposite wall, was assigned the Battle of Cassina, but his genius, always focused on the human body, did not choose the din of combat, but the moment before, a group of soldiers surprised by the alarm while bathing in the Arno River. It was his excuse to unleash an unprecedented anatomical study, a symphony of male bodies in tension, twisting, hastily dressing, every muscle vibrating with the urgency of the moment. The rivalry was no secret. It vibrated in the air of the city. It is said that one day, while Leonardo walked through the square, Michelangelo, with his characteristic roughness, publicly confronted him about his failure, with the great bronze horse for the Sforza, a wound that time had not healed. You, who made a model of a horse to cast in bronze and could not cast it, and to your shame you abandoned it. Leonardo felt the edge of those words, the insolence of a youth that did not ask for permission, but claimed its space with the force of a torrent. However, destiny is often a more capricious craftsman than man. Neither of the two masterpieces was completed within those walls. Leonardo, always experimenting, attempted a technique of painting with encaustic, inspired by the ancient Romans. But the heat of the braziers was not enough to dry the pigments. The paint began to drip, to dissolve, as if the wall itself wept for the impossibility of art. Frustrated, he abandoned the project. Michelangelo, for his part, was called to Rome by Pope Julius II before he could transfer his design to the wall. The Sistine Chapel awaited his torment and his glory. The two battles remained as ghosts in the Hall of the 500. Their cartoons, however, became legend, the school of the world for a generation of artists, including a young Raphael, who came to study those opposing visions of human genius. Over time, even those preparatory drawings were lost, cut, scattered, faded like an echo in the fog. For Leonardo, the episode was a bitter realization. The Florence that had seen him flourish now acclaimed a new hero, one whose brutal energy seemed more in tune with the pulse of the new century. The technical failure of his mural, coupled with the growing shadow of his rival, left a residue of melancholy in his spirit. Perhaps the city was no longer his home. The tide of the Renaissance was changing, and its current began to carry him toward other ports, toward other patrons. His gaze, perhaps, was no longer on the walls of Florence, but on the paths that opened beyond its hills. And so, the rivalry with that young and tempestuous Buonarroti, combined with the incessant murmur of a Florence that no longer felt entirely hers, began to weigh on Leonardo's spirit. It was a subtle chill, a frost in the soul that did not arise from the season, but from the spirit. The city of the Medici, the cradle of his genius, had become a stage for bitter competitions, a place where the echo of his name mingled with that of others, newer, fiercer. At the age of 50, burdened with the weight of unfinished worlds in his notebooks and in his mind, Leonardo felt once again the call of the road. It was not the flight of a defeated man, but the natural movement of a tide seeking new shores. The road, in Italy, at the beginning of the 16th century, was an uncertain place, a tapestry of dust, danger, and opportunity. And it was on that tapestry that fate wove for Leonardo a meeting with one of the most formidable and feared figures of his time, Cesare Borgia. The son of Pope Alexander VI, the Duke of Valentinois, was a force of nature, a storm of ambition and cruelty sweeping through Romagna, unifying its dissenting cities under an iron fist. He was the prince whom Machiavelli observed with a mixture of horror and admiration, the man for whom the end justified any means. And to his service entered Leonardo, not as an artist, but as the chief architect and military engineer. It was a strange pact, an alliance between the most curious mind of Christendom and the most relentless will. While one sought to unveil the soul of the world, the other only yearned to possess its body of earth and stone. Leonardo travelled with Borgia's army through the conquered lands. He rode through the valleys of Umbria and the Marches, feeling the cold of the metal of his surveying instruments against his side. the smell of damp leather and distant gunpowder. He did not carry a sword, his weapon was observation. At night, by the flickering light of a candle in a tent, while the soldiers slept their exhausted sleep, he drew. He created maps of astonishing, almost divine precision. The plan of Imola was not just a representation of streets and walls. It was a bird's eye view, as if a bird had halted its flight to dictate to him the secret geometry of the city. He studied the fortifications of Urbino, Cesena, Rimini. He proposed how to divert rivers to besiege a fortress, how to drain marshes to facilitate the passage of troops. His genius, which had once sought harmony in the face of a virgin or in the proportions of man, now applied itself to the cold and brutal logistics of war. The safe conduct that Borgia granted him is a testament to this strange symbiosis. In it, all his lieutenants and subjects were ordered to give our esteemed and most excellent architect free passage, assistance, and total freedom to see, measure, and inspect whatever he desired. Leonardo was the eye of the conqueror. What did he think? What did he feel upon witnessing the lethal efficacy of the machinery he helped to perfect? His notebooks hold an eloquent silence. He noted the trajectory of a projectile with the same curiosity with which he studied the fluttering of a dragonfly's wings. Perhaps he saw in war, as in everything else, another complex system, another phenomenon of nature worthy of understanding. But fortune, like the moon, has its phases. The empire of Cesare Borgia, built on cunning, fear, and papal power, was as brilliant as it was fragile. In the summer of 1503, the sudden death of his father, the Pope, was the final blow. The power of the Borgias crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide. Cesare was arrested, exiled, and his duchy dissolved into the chaos from which it had emerged. Leonardo once again found himself without a patron, a drifting traveller. He returned to Florence. He was not the same man who had left. The dust of the roads of Romagna still clung to his clothes, but more profoundly, in his mind, the intimate knowledge of the anatomy of power and conflict had settled. He had seen up close the roar and fury of men, and now the Florentine Republic, which had seen him depart as a disputing artist, welcomed him back as an expert in the art of war. They had a new commission for him, an immense wall in the Palazzo Vecchio that needed to be covered with the glory of a victory. The echo of Borgia's marches still resonated in his memory, and now Florence asked him to give shape and colour to that roar. After the journeys and the echo of distant courts, Leonardo's path brought him back to the heart of his lineage. Florence. The city that had witnessed his birth as an artist now breathed a new air, that of a proud and defiant republic. And at the centre of that pride, like a stone lung, stood the Palazzo della Signoria. Within its walls, in the immense and cold vastness of the Salone dei Cinquecento, the Republic sought to engrave its memory in the lime, to immortalize its power in pigment. The commission was a monument to Florentine glory, but also a silent duel. On one wall, Leonardo would paint the Battle of Anghiari, the victory over Milan. On the opposite wall, his young and tempestuous rival, Michelangelo, would depict the Battle of Cassina. Two geniuses, two visions of the world, confronted in the same sacred space of civic power. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the unspoken tension, with the murmur of what was to come. Leonardo, already a man who had witnessed the passage of half a century, did not approach the task as a mere chronicler of victory. In his notebooks, where the soul was laid bare, there was no room for easy heroism. He sought the visceral truth of combat. He studied the fury of the horses, their bulging eyes, the steam rising from their nostrils in the cold air of battle. He drew the faces of men, contorted by a scream that time would never silence, the tension of muscles beneath the skin, the weight of iron on weary shoulders. He did not seek to paint soldiers, but the very soul of war, its bestialissima pazzia, its bestial madness, as he would call it. He wanted the viewer to hear the clamour of steel, to smell the sweat and blood, to feel the panic that precedes the last breath. His preparatory cartoon, the central section known as The Struggle for the Standard, became legend even before it touched the wall. It was a whirlwind of bodies, a knot of equine and human fury so violent and alive that artists from all over Italy would pilgrimage to study it. It was, they said, a school for the world. But genius, at times, is a sun that draws too close to its own wax wings. Leonardo, tormented by the memory of the mould that threatened his Last Supper, was wary of the traditional fresco. He turned his gaze to the ancients, to the pages of Pliny the Elder, and believed he found the solution in a lost technique, encaustic. He would mix the pigments with wax, and once the paint was applied, fix it to the wall with heat, creating a durable and brilliant finish like that of the paintings of ancient Rome. The experiment began. On the prepared wall, Leonardo's colours burst forth with an intensity never seen before. The red of blood, the shine of metal, the taut flesh of the horses. It was life itself, convulsive and terrible. To fix the work, he ordered large braziers of coal to be lit and brought close to the wall. The heat, immense and uncontrollable, did not reach the heights of the mural. And then, before the astonished gaze of his assistants, the paint began to weep. The colours, vivid and fierce, liquefied, sliding down the wall in slow and tragic streams. The bestial madness he had sought to capture turned into a formless chaos, a stain of melted wax and ruined pigments. The dream was dissolving. The work was abandoned. The great duel of titans in the Salon dei Cinquecento was never completed. Leonardo's mural, covered and ultimately lost beneath the renovations of later centuries, became a ghost, an echo more powerful than many finished works, living only in the feverish sketches of his hand and in the copies that others made of his magnificent failure. For Leonardo, it was a deep wound. The wall of Florence had not only rejected his painting, it seemed to have rejected his tireless quest for innovation. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows of the palazzo no longer illuminated the promise of glory, but the dust settling over a dead project. The failure was more than a technical setback. It was a farewell. The wind blowing from the Alps carried with it the whisper of a new patron, a young king who not only coveted the artist's hand, but the company of his mind. France awaited. The echo of the lime and oil that peeled from the wall in Florence still resonated in his ears, a whisper of failure that the Tiber could not silence. Rome, in the winter of its life, offered him no comfort. He felt like a relic in a city that now danced to the feverish rhythm of Raphael and the titanic strength of Michelangelo. His projects for the Medici were small, almost trivial, shadows of the visions that still burned in his mind. Leonardo, the man who had wanted to divert rivers and give wings to humanity, now found himself designing stables and draining swamps. The tide of fortune, which had once carried him to the highest crests of the Italian Renaissance, seemed to recede, leaving him on a lonely shore, surrounded by the shipwrecked treasures of his own notebooks. But across the Alps, a new sun was rising. A young king, Francis I of France, had just donned the crown, and, with it, an ambition that was measured not only in leagues of conquered land. Francis was a man of the Renaissance in its purest essence, a warrior on the battlefield and a poet at court, a monarch who not only collected art but longed for the company of artists. He had grown up hearing legends about the Florentine master, the man whose mind encompassed painting, engineering, anatomy, and philosophy. To him, Leonardo was not a craftsman, however sublime. He was a lineage of knowledge made flesh. Fate wove their meeting in the year 1515. After the bloody victory at the Battle of Marignano, which stained the Lombard fields red and delivered Milan to the French crown, Francis and Leonardo met. It was not the encounter of a conqueror and a subject, but that of an admirer and his idol. The king, at the height of his youthful power, saw in the eyes of the elderly master not the fatigue of years, but the unquenchable light of infinite curiosity. He saw the sketches of flying machines, the studies of the human heart, the unfathomable smile of a Florentine lady, and he made him an offer that was not a commission, but an invitation to immortality. He did not ask for a work, he asked for his presence. He offered him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect of the king, and with it a generous pension and a new home. A home. Thus, at 64 years of age, Leonardo crossed the Alps. The journey must have been a slow, melancholic procession. He left behind his land, the tongue of Dante and the sun of Tuscany, forever. In the carts that followed him, he carried not great belongings, but the luggage of a lifetime. 3 of his most cherished paintings, including the enigmatic Mona Lisa that he had never delivered, and above all, the treasure of his notebooks. Thousands of pages filled with the murmur of his thoughts, the map of a world that only he had explored. France welcomed him, not with the demands of a patron, but with the embrace of a son. The king presented him with the Château de Clos-Lucé, a small and elegant palace of pink brick and white stone, just steps from his own residence in the majestic Château d'Amboise on the banks of the Loire. It is said that an underground passage connected the king's dwelling with that of the master, so that the young monarch could visit him at any hour without the pomp of the court and sit to listen. He called him Father. There, in the Loire Valley, amidst the mist rising from the river and the silence of the forests, Leonardo found a peace that Italy had denied him. He was no longer asked for battles for walls or urgent portraits. His only task was to converse, to dream aloud, to unfold before the astonished eyes of the king the universe he contained. At last, someone did not want to use his hands, but to listen to his soul. In the stillness of Amboise, surrounded by respect and affection, Leonardo began the last and perhaps most important of his labors: to organize the vast and chaotic legacy of his knowledge before time took it away with him. His hands, one of them already betrayed by paralysis, turned the pages of his codices, where the flight of a bird and the heartbeat of a heart contained the same divine truth. He no longer sought to create a new work for the world, but to order the universe he had discovered within himself. The mists of the Loire rose slowly from the river, enveloping the castle of Clos-Lucé in a damp, almost liquid silence. There, in the autumn of his life, Leonardo was no longer the military engineer or the court painter besieged by deadlines. He was the philosopher, the sage whom the young King Francis I visited not to commission a portrait, but to listen to the murmur of an intellect that had navigated all the seas of knowledge. The roar of battles and the whispers of courts had faded, replaced by the crackling of the fire and the brush of his own fingers, already etched with wrinkles over thousands of pages. For his true legacy, the one he treasured with a quiet urgency, was not in the dry pigments on a wall in Milan, nor in the ambiguous smile of a Florentine lady. His soul resided in those notebooks, a forest of paper and ink that had grown with him for decades, written in his strange mirror handwriting, as if he wished to protect his thoughts from the casual eye, or perhaps from himself. Those codices were the map of his tireless mind. They were a testament to his deepest faith. Saper vedere, knowing how to see beyond the surface, to the hidden mechanics of the world. He would sit for hours, lost in the memory of his observations. He saw again the water of the Arno, not as a uniform mass, but as a dance of infinite threads of current, of whirlpools that were born and died with the same complexity as a human life. He drew the turbulence with a precision that no one had attempted before, and in the spirals of the water he found the same pattern as in the curls of an angel's hair or in the way a plant grew. For him, everything was connected by an invisible grammar. The world was a poem written with the same laws, from the vein of a leaf to the artery that pulsed in a man's neck. And then there was the sky, the dream of flight, an insistent echo of his youth, an obsession that never left him. It was not the arrogance of Icarus that drove him, but the patience of the craftsman who disassembles a clock to understand its pulse. He spent years studying the flapping of birds and bats' wings, filling pages with analyses of the anatomy of their hollow bones, the twist of their feathers, the resistance of the air. His designs for the flying machine, the ornithopter, were a marvel of engineering, a skeleton of wood and taut fabric that promised to lift man towards the realm of birds. We know he built prototypes. We can imagine the creaking of the wood, the smell of oil and leather, the held breath of an assistant, and the inevitable stillness of failure, the weight of gravity that always, in the end, claimed its victory. But within that failure resided the seed of a new science. Leonardo did not just dream of flying. He was, in essence, the first aeronautical engineer, applying observation and mechanics to a longing as ancient as humanity itself. His curiosity also descended to the depths of the earth. In the stones he found in the mountains, he saw shells of marine creatures. While others spoke of a universal flood, his mind, accustomed to thinking in vast stretches of time, understood the truth. Those peaks had once been the bed of an ancient ocean. In the fossilized stone, he did not see the mark of divine punishment, but the weight of an immemorial time, a time that dwarfed the lives of kings and civilizations. But this vast ocean of knowledge was destined to become, after his death, an underground river. His notebooks would be dismembered, sold, forgotten. His discoveries in anatomy, optics, geology, and botany would remain hidden for centuries, while other men, over time, would retrace, step by step, the same paths he had already walked alone. His science was an echo cast into a valley too wide. The answer would take generations to return. The world was not yet ready to hear the complete symphony that resonated in his mind. And yet, In that quest for the perfect form, for the underlying mechanism that governed apparent chaos, his mind soared from the microcosm of a flower or the muscle of a wing to the structure that contained all lives and all movements. The city. The same eye that saw harmony in the current of a river now sought it in the layout of the streets and the solidity of stone. And so, just as he observed the flow of blood through veins or the course of rivers carving the land, Leonardo turned his gaze upon the city of men. He did not see it as merely a collection of houses and walls, but as a living organism, often sick, congested, and feverish. His mind, which had just mapped the currents of air and the tides of the ocean, turned towards stone and mortar, seeking in them the same harmony, the same underlying order that governed the universe. The Milan of the Sforza, like so many cities of his time, still bore the scars of the plague. In its narrow and dark alleys, the air stagnated, heavy and humid, a breeding ground for disease. Shadow was a perpetual resident, and the sun, a scarce visitor. Leonardo walked through those twisted paths, feeling the chaotic pulse of the crowd, the clatter of carts, the smell of waste. And in his mind, as the real world pressed around him, another city began to rise. A city of light and reason. In the pages of his codices, among studies of anatomy and war machines, the plans for his ideal city were born. It was not the fantasy of an artist, but the logic of a physician prescribing the cure for a sick body. His vision was radical. He conceived a city laid out in two levels. Above, on the sunlit surface, wide streets and squares would extend for the promenade of nobles and citizens, with elegant palaces and clean air. Below, in the bowels of the city, a hidden world of canals and service routes would allow the silent movement of goods, the transport of heavy loads, and, above all, the evacuation of wastewater. It was a circulatory system for the metropolis, veins of clean water and arteries for waste, ensuring that commercial life did not contaminate civic life. Every detail was imbued with his observant genius. The stairs of the buildings would be wide and gently sloped to reduce fatigue. The streets, oriented to maximize light and ventilation. The architecture itself was to serve man, not oppress him. He dreamed of churches with central plans, circular or octagonal, where the community would gather around a sacred center, reflecting the perfection of the circle and the sphere that fascinated him so much. They were prayers in stone to divine proportion, an architectural echo of his Vitruvian Man. But the world of princes and merchants moved at a slower pace than that of thought. His visions, so clear on paper, were too costly, too bold for an era still clinging to the security of its medieval walls. His cities of ink and paper never rose. His plans slept in the folios of his codices, seeds thrown into a frozen field, waiting for a future time to germinate. Even so, the echo of his ideas resonated through the centuries. It is said that in the Loire Valley, at the magnificent Château de Chambord, the double helix staircase that ascends towards the sky without its two paths ever crossing is a direct tribute to his sketches, a perfect metaphor for his own mind. Two worlds, that of art and that of science, ascending in parallel, intertwined yet distinct, towards a single pinnacle of understanding. His designs for fortifications, which applied geometry to deflect cannon fire, or his ideas for drawbridges and prefabricated buildings, demonstrated that for him, architecture was not just aesthetics, but an extension of engineering and a solution to human problems. Stone could not move as quickly as his thought. The buildings he designed remained, for the most part, as ghosts in his notebooks, monuments to what could have been. And perhaps in the silence of his study, surrounded by these unfulfilled dreams, Leonardo understood that his true vocation was not to build for the men of his time, but to chart the map of a possible world. He left behind the plans for the perfect city and turned his attention to what had always called him: the flight of a bird, the erosion of a rock, the next mystery. The pursuit itself was his home, his only and true architecture. From the ideal cities he dreamed of on paper, with their underground canals and squares bathed in calculated light, flowed a logic that went beyond stone and mortar. Those designs, as we have seen, were a reflection of a mind-seeking order in chaos, harmony in the crowd. But beyond the architecture of men, there existed a cathedral more vast and complex that Leonardo longed to map, that of knowledge itself. His life was not a succession of projects, but a single and feverish expedition to the heart of reality. For Leonardo, the universe was not a collection of isolated facts, but a tapestry woven with invisible threads that connected all things. To see a wave breaking on the shore was no different from observing the curl of a hair or the whirlwind of a tornado in the distance. The water flowing through an aqueduct followed the same secret laws as the blood pulsing in a man's veins. This was his fundamental truth, the principle that guided his hand and intellect. Saper vedere, the knowledge of seeing. It was not a simple glance, but a visual dissection, a deep understanding of the forms, forces, and functions that lie beneath the surface of the visible. His curiosity was a tide that knew no rest. While his contemporaries specialized in closing small fields of knowledge, Leonardo tore down all the walls. He moved from the anatomy of a bird to the design of a flying machine, from the study of light on a draped silk to the formulation of the laws of optics, from the dissection of an ox eye with its moisture and glassy stillness to capturing the soul in the portrait of a Florentine lady. He saw no fracture between art and science. They were, for him, two languages to describe the same beauty, the same immutable truth. The brush was a tool of inquiry, as valid as the scalpel. This thirst was both his glory and his condemnation. The patrons, men of action and results, grew impatient. Ludovico Sforza awaited a colossal bronze statue, and Leonardo lost himself in the study of molds. Cesare Borgia asked for maps and war machines, and he filled his notebooks with sketches of marine fossils found on the peaks of the Apennines, wondering how the sea had reached such heights. He was accused of being scattered, of being a dreamer, of leaving a lineage of unfinished works. They did not understand that for him, the final work was often less important than the journey of discovery. The knowledge acquired in the process was the true treasure. His notebooks, thousands of pages written in his peculiar mirror handwriting, are not diaries. They are the echo of a mind in perpetual motion. They are the record of an incessant dialogue with the world, a titanic attempt to capture every facet of being before time turned it to dust. There coexist the flight of a dragonfly and the blueprint of a fortress, the calculation to divert a river and the enigmatic smile of a face, the fury of a storm and the delicate structure of a lily flower. They are fragments of a universal encyclopedia that only existed, complete, within his skull. In the end, his quest was not for power, nor even for fame. It was an almost spiritual pursuit, the need of a man to understand his place in the great mechanism of the cosmos. Each observation, each drawing was a secular prayer, an act of reverence before the genius of the Creator or of nature itself. The weight of thousands of pages, of hours stolen from sleep under the light of a candle, was also the weight of the years. The body, that perfect machine he had studied so much, began to feel the wear of friction and time. And as the sun of Italy began to descend on the horizon of his life, the gaze of the old master turned northward, towards the mists of France, seeking not a new pattern, but a final harbour. A tranquil refuge where the echo of his thoughts could, at last, find order before silence. The tide of life, which had swept Leonardo through the courts and battlefields of Italy, finally found its calm in the mists of the Loire Valley. The journey through the Alps in 1516 was not that of an artist in search of fortune, but that of a patriarch carrying the lineage of an entire era. On the back of a mule, a man of 64 years, with a long beard as white as winter frost, carried with him not only his clothes, but also the weight and glory of his thoughts. 3 of his most cherished paintings, and thousands of pages of notebooks that contained the pulse of his insatiable curiosity. France welcomed him not with the clamour of competition, but with the reverence of a disciple. The young King Francis I, a monarch touched by the sun of the Renaissance, saw in him not a servant, but a father. Mon père, he called him. He granted him the castle of Clos-Lucé, a mansion of pink stone and slate roofs, connected by an underground passage to the royal castle of Amboise. It was not a gilded cage, but a sanctuary, a place for the rest of the warrior of intellect. There, in the light of France, softer, more diffused than the sharp sun of Tuscany, Leonardo spent his last 3 years. The echo of his footsteps on the cold stone of Clos-Lucé was that of a man who finally walked without the urgency of a commission or the shadow of a rival. His right hand, once firm to trace the perfection of a face or the mechanism of a machine, now hung inert, betrayed by time. But the left, his creative hand, could still hold a charcoal, could still arrange the notes of a life. And that is what he dedicated himself to order the chaos of his genius. He would sit for hours, surrounded by his manuscripts, classifying studies on the flight of birds, the turbulence of water, the anatomy hidden beneath human skin, the geometry of shadows. Each page was a fragment of his soul, an unfinished conversation with the universe. King Francis would come to him not to ask for a new painting, but to listen. He would sit beside him, fascinated as the old master, with a measured voice, spoke to him about the course of the planets or the design of an ideal city for Romorantin, an architectural dream that would never see stone. He sought the gold of his conversation, not just that of his brushes. In his workshop, the Mona Lisa continued to smile her secret, now under a different sky. Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist, his other companions in exile, seemed burdened with a new melancholy, that of a long and serene twilight. Leonardo hardly painted anymore. Perhaps he added a veil of varnish here, an imperceptible hue there. But his great work now was to be himself, the living repository of knowledge that the world was just beginning to glimpse. It was a profoundly human spectacle. The universal genius reduced to the fragility of a body that was wearing out. He designed parties and automatons for the court, like a mechanical lion that walked, and opened its chest to reveal a bouquet of lilies a final flash of his theatrical ingenuity. But they were gestures, echoes of a force that was retreating like the tide. Each conversation was a testament, each drawing a last will. He knew, as the tree knows in autumn, that its leaves must fall to nourish the earth. The winter of 1518 loomed over the Loire Valley, covering the vineyards with a mantle of silence. The master's health visibly faltered. The body surrendered, but the mind, that vast universe of gears and stars, of anatomies and currents of water, continued to burn with a serene flame, preparing for its final dissolution. Leonardo, from his window, observed the slow flow of the river, its leaden color under the gray sky. Perhaps, in the murmur of the French water, he heard the distant echo of the Arno of his childhood. The circle was about to close. The last stroke of a life drawn with the ink of the universe awaited its moment. In the silence of a French chamber, far, so far from Vinci, the tide of time, which drags everything along, had brought Leonardo to the serene shore of his final years in Amboise. The deep green of the Loire Valley, the ancient stone of Clos-Lucé, were the final setting for a man who had contained entire worlds in his mind. The winter of 1519 was not harsh in the landscape, but it was in the body of the master. At 67 years of age was a lead weight in his bones, a cold that neither the warmth of the hearth nor the affection of a king could dissipate. His world had shrunk. He no longer traversed the dusty roads of Italy, nor scrutinized the horizon from the battlements of Milan. His universe was now the room where the morning sun drew rectangles of light on the wooden floor, a universe populated by the ghosts of his notebooks. The right hand, the one that had shaped doubt on the faces of the apostles and had sketched the plans of impossible machines, now lay inert, defeated by a paralysis that had robbed him of the final gesture of drawing. It was a cruel irony of fate. The instrument of his genius had fallen silent before his mind, but the mind, tireless, continued its work. With the help of his faithful Francesco Melzi, the disciple who had become both shadow and sun, Leonardo spent hours organizing the lineage of his thoughts. Thousands of pages, a whirlwind of anatomy, botany, optics, and art were his true legacy. In the young face of Melzi, he saw not only devotion, but the promise that this ocean of knowledge would not dry up with his last breath. King Francis I, young and filled with an almost filial admiration, visited him often. He did not come to see a painter, but to see a philosopher, a wise man. He sat by his bedside, listening to the echo of a voice that was fading, aware that he was witnessing the twilight of an era. On the 23rd of April, sensing the approach of the end, Leonardo dictated his will. It was his final act of order in a world he had always tried to understand and classify. With the lucidity that defied the fragility of his body, he arranged his possessions. To Melzi, his executor, he bequeathed the instruments and the books, the drawings and the manuscripts, the entire soul of his work. To his servant, he left half of his vineyard. To his brothers in Italy, a sum of money. And for himself, he requested a humble burial in the church of Saint-Florentin, in the castle of Amboise, and 60 masses for the repose of his soul. The man who had unveiled the secrets of the human body now surrendered, with the simple faith of his ancestors, to the mysteries of the spirit. The days that followed were a slow fading away. The fever arrived like a fog, erasing the outlines of the room. The outside world, with the song of the birds and the murmur of the river, became a distant sound, like a memory of another life. On the 2nd of May, 1519, the breath that had sustained so much curiosity, that had formulated so many questions, simply ceased. He left in silence, like the light of a candle that burns out in the stillness of the night. It is said that he died in the arms of King Francis, who, weeping, felt the spirit of the greatest man of his time slipping away. It is a powerful image, a canvas painted by memory and desire. History, more sober, suggests that the king was elsewhere, but the legend itself is a testament to the love and reverence he inspired. Perhaps the physical fact did not matter, but the symbolic truth. A king mourned the death of an artist as if he had lost a father, an entire kingdom of wisdom. His body was buried where he had requested, in the cold stone of Amboise. The rain of the French spring washed the freshly turned earth. For the world, a man had died. But in the silent room of Clos Lucé, on the work table, lay a legacy that could not be measured in gold or land. They were seeds. Seeds of a future he had glimpsed with astonishing clarity. The man had vanished, but his echo, contained in thousands of pages, was just beginning to resonate through the centuries to come. The news of his death took time to cross the Alps. It did not travel with the urgency of a royal messenger's gallop, but with the slowness of a rumour, like the fog that slips from the French valleys to the plains of Lombardy. In Amboise, the cold stone of the chapel of Saint-Hubert had welcomed his remains, and the world, for a moment, seemed unaware that one of its most complex lights had been extinguished. But the absence of a man like Leonardo is not a void. It is a distinct presence, an echo that begins to resonate in the places he inhabited and in the minds he touched. His impact was not an explosion, but a slow and deep tide that reconfigured the shores of Renaissance thought. In the workshops of Florence and Rome, the younger artists, those who had grown up in the shadow of his name, could no longer look at a face in the same way. The sfumato, that pictorial haze with which Leonardo dissolved the contours of flesh and landscape, ceased to be a mere technique and became a philosophy. It was the understanding that life has no sharp edges, that joy merges with melancholy, and that light only exists in its perpetual dance with shadow. It is said that the young Raphael of Urbino, upon contemplating the portraits that Leonardo had left in Florence, felt the vertigo of a new possibility, that a canvas could contain not only the likeness of a person, but the whisper of their soul. The smile of his Donna Velata owes something to that of Lisa Gherardini, a silent tribute from one genius to another. Beyond the portrait, his conception of drama changed visual narrative forever. Before the Last Supper, representations of that sacred moment were often static, a row of solemn figures at a table. Leonardo breathed life into them, capturing the precise instant when a word, "One of you will betray me," becomes a shockwave that travels through bodies and spirits. Each apostle reacts according to their nature: surprise, denial, fear, anger. It was theatre, psychology, and theology painted with tempera on a damp wall. The artists who came after, from Andrea del Sarto to Titian himself, learned from him to compose not only figures, but emotions. However, the deepest echo of Leonardo was also the quietest. His art was visible, a bonfire that all could admire. But his science was a universe contained in thousands of pages that only one man guarded. Francesco Melzi, the faithful disciple, the heir to his codices, returned to Italy with a treasure that the world was not prepared to understand. In his villa of Vaprio d'Adda, Melzi spent the rest of his life organizing that labyrinth of ideas. Studies on the flight of birds alongside designs for war machines, the anatomy of a human heart alongside the geometry of a flower. The Renaissance, which drank so deeply from his art, barely tasted a drop of his science. The revolution he could have initiated in hydraulics, optics, or anatomy remained latent, like an extraordinary seed planted in a private archive, waiting for a sun that would take centuries to arrive. Perhaps his most enduring legacy was not a work or an invention, but the embodiment of an ideal. He became the archetype of the uomo universale, the quintessential man of the Renaissance. But not because of the dispersion of his interests, but because of his ability to unite them. For him, art and science were not two separate realms, but two languages to describe the same truth. The curve of a bird's wing obeyed the same mathematical laws as the arch of a cathedral. The turbulence of water in a river was a mirror of the curls of human hair. This unified vision of the cosmos, this faith in the connection of all things, was his most radical gift. As the decades passed, his direct influence on painting faded, absorbed and transformed by new styles. Mannerism twisted his forms, and Baroque intensified his drama. His name became a legend, that of a nearly magical painter who also drew flying machines. The figure of the man slowly faded to give way to myth, but time, which wears everything down, also preserves. In the silence of a library, beneath a fine layer of dust, the true lineage of his thought awaited. He had not died completely. He was merely sleeping. The tides of time, like those of a memoryless ocean, cover and uncover the shores of history. After the immediate brilliance that his genius projected onto the Renaissance, the figure of Leonardo da Vinci began to slowly recede, sinking into a haze of semi-oblivion. The 17th and 18th centuries, with their Cartesian reason and neoclassical order, remembered him primarily as the author of a handful of masterpieces. He was the painter of a solemn dinner and a smile that no one could decipher. His name was a noble stone, but covered by the moss of distant and superficial admiration. The underground river of his thought, that which flowed through thousands of secret pages, remained hidden, a barely perceptible whisper beneath the ground of European culture. His codices, scattered across libraries and the hands of often indifferent collectors, slept a dream of ink and dust, their mirror writing guarding a universe that the world no longer knew how to read. But memory, like the seed beneath winter, awaits its season. And the season of Leonardo arrived with the tremor of the 19th century. First came the Romantics, spirits drawn to the sublime, the unfinished, and the mysterious. In Leonardo, they did not see the perfect craftsman, but the solitary soul, the misunderstood genius whose curiosity overflowed the limits of his own time. Writers like Stendhal and Théophile Gautier bowed not only before the technique of the Mona Lisa, but before the psychological abyss that her smile seemed to open. They saw in him an archetype, a Faust who did not sell his soul, but sought to encompass it entirely through knowledge. It was a rediscovery of the heart, a fascination with the man who dared to dream of flying while dissecting the mystery of an eyelid. However, the true intellectual earthquake was yet to come. It occurred in the silence of archives, under the light of gas lamps casting dancing shadows over the desks of patient men. By the end of the century, With the fervor of new nations seeking their foundational heroes, scholars began the titanic task of deciphering and cataloguing his manuscripts. It was an act of archaeology of the spirit. By inverting Leonardo's speculative writing, they did not merely read words. They opened a door to a mind that had lived centuries ahead. Let us imagine the astonishment of that scholar who, expecting to find sketches of angels, encounters the design of an armored tank, or a study on the turbulence of water that anticipates modern physics. Let us imagine his vertigo at contemplating anatomical drawings of terrifying precision, traced in an era when the interior of the body was a forbidden and feared territory. Page after page, the painter faded away to give way to the engineer, the botanist, the urban planner, the anatomist, the musician, the philosopher, the Codex Atlanticus, the Codex Leicester, the Windsor notebooks. Each was a fragment of a lost continent, the echo of his hammer in. Verrocchio's workshop now mingled with the whisper of his calculations on friction and the flight of birds. The modern world, the age of the steam engine and specialization, suddenly found itself facing a ghost that both embarrassed and inspired it in equal measure. In a society that had divorced the artist from the scientist, the poet from the engineer, Leonardo rose as a beacon of lost unity. He was no longer just a genius of the Renaissance. He became the timeless symbol of human potential, the universal man whose thirst for knowledge knew no boundaries. His rediscovery was not merely the exhumation of a historical figure, but the revelation of an ideal. Ordinary people, reading the first translations of his notes, felt an intimate connection with that man who marveled equally at the mechanism of a lock and the movement of the planets. Thus, the figure of Leonardo was reconstructed, not with the stone of Florence or the plaster of Milan, but with the ink recovered from his thoughts. His name ceased to be just an echo in the gallery of a museum to become a living presence, a dialogue partner across the centuries. And with the light of this rediscovery, there also came the shadow of an urgent question: how to protect from time that which time itself had returned to us. The canvases cracked, the pigment faded, the paper became brittle. The treasure, barely unearthed, already showed the scars of its long abandonment. Thus, after the echo of its rediscovery, the world found not only a name, but a lineage of fragile works, a heritage whispered in pigments that faded and in paper that became brittle like the skin of autumn. Because Leonardo's work was not carved into the eternity of stone, but entrusted to wood, plaster, and ink, materials that breathe, that age, that remember the forest and the water from which they were born. And the struggle for its preservation is not a battle against time, but a dialogue with it, an attempt to persuade the tide of forgetfulness to recede, if only for one more moment. The first and most tragic battlefield was a refectory in Milan. There, on the wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the Last Supper began to die almost from the moment of its birth. Leonardo, in his impatience to capture light and emotion with the delicacy of oil, had rejected the discipline of traditional fresco, which binds colour to the damp wall in an indissoluble embrace. Instead, he applied tempera and oil on dry plaster, an act of rebellion against the haste of art that was, ironically, his own sentence. Humidity, that cold breath rising from the Lombard earth, became his enemy. The colour began to flake off, peeling away like dead skin, leaving behind a ghost of the original scene. Over the centuries, well-meaning but clumsy men attempted to save it. They covered it with layers of paint and varnish, like placing a heavy cloak over a feverish body, suffocating its breath. Each restoration was a new wound, a new veil over the master's intention. It was not until the late 20th century that a new breed of guardians, armed with microscopes and solvents of infinite patience, undertook the Herculean task of retracing that path. For more than 2 decades, they worked centimetre by centimetre, like archaeologists of light, removing the additions of others to find, beneath it all, the original tremor of Leonardo's hand. What they rescued was not the work in its splendor, but its wounded truth, a sacred relic, more moving in its fragility than in its lost perfection. His notebooks, those labyrinths of thought where science and art danced together, faced another kind of dispersion. After the death of his faithful Francesco Melzi, the first guardian of the flame, the codices were dismembered, sold, scattered like seeds by the winds of history. Each page was a fragment of the soul of a giant. Their preservation was a feat of gathering, a patient search through libraries and private collections. Today, technology offers a new form of immortality, digitization. Every stroke of the pen, every note in mirror writing, is translated into the incorporeal language of light, creating an echo that no longer fears fire or humidity. An archive of the soul of Leonardo, accessible to any curious pair of eyes in any corner of the world. And then there is her, the Mona Lisa. Her battle has not been so much against material decomposition, although the fine poplar wood that supports her bends with the memory of 500 winters. Her struggle has been against love, a love so intense that it turned her into an icon and thus into a target. After her theft in 1911 and the attack suffered, her preservation transformed into seclusion. Today she lives behind a bulletproof glass, in a controlled atmosphere, observed by millions but touched only by purified air. Restorers no longer dare to clean her surface darkened by ancient varnish, for fear of altering the expression that has enchanted the world. The crécoleur, that fine network of cracks that traverses her face, is accepted as the map of her long life. We preserve her by keeping her at a distance, turning her into a prisoner of her own fame, a distant apparition. Thus, the preservation of Leonardo's legacy is a lesson in humility. It is the silent work of men and women who listen to the slow breathing of wood, who understand the fatigue of pigment, and who know that the past cannot be returned, only its ruins honored. They are the last apprentices of the master, whose only duty is to ensure that his voice, though weak and cracked by time, never falls into absolute silence. And by being saved, by being framed and protected, the work ceased to belong solely to art to enter the vast and noisy territory of myth, where its image would be replicated, reinvented, and consumed in ways that Leonardo himself could never have imagined. We have spoken of the struggle against time, of the patient alchemy that seeks to rescue a faded pigment or a brittle paper from the jaws of oblivion. But there exists another form of preservation, one that is noisier and more feverish, which does not take place in silent laboratories, but in the public square of collective imagination. Thus, while the restorers labored to restore color to their murals, the world began to paint its own Leonardo, an echo of the man who would transform into a familiar spectre, a ghost walking through the hallways of our culture. The historical Leonardo, with his doubts, his failures, and the weight of his unfinished projects, began to slowly fade away, like a figure receding into the mist of twilight. In his place, an archetype emerged. His name ceased to belong solely to the annals of the Renaissance, to become a universal symbol, that of the absolute genius, the man who knew everything and could do everything. A blank canvas upon which each era would project its own longings and fears. Literature was the first to claim his ghost. Historical novels imagined him walking the streets of Florence, his eyes capturing details that no one else saw, his mind a silent whirlwind of ideas. But it was in our time, a time hungry for secrets and conspiracies, when his figure was woven into a vast modern fable. Suddenly, his masterpieces were not just windows into the human soul, but treasure maps, cryptograms leading to forbidden truths. The Mona Lisa no longer held the secret of a smile, but that of a lost lineage. The Last Supper was not the drama of a betrayal, but a board of numbers and hidden messages beneath the varnish of the centuries. In these narratives, the artist, the scientist, the thinker became something more, an initiate, a guardian of ancestral mysteries. The man who sought knowledge was reimagined as the man who possessed it and concealed it. Then came the flickering light of the cinematograph, and later the cold glow of television screens. There, Leonardo adopted countless faces. Sometimes he was the wise man with a white beard, dispensing pearls of wisdom to kings and young heroes. Other times, a determined adventurer, almost a man of action, using his ingenuity to escape dangers and solve palace intrigues. Rarely did we find the weary man jotting down in his notebooks the price of a candle or the recipe for a soup. The complexity of his spirit, his melancholy, and his procrastination were flattened to shape a simpler character, more useful for the narrative. The infallible inventor, the perfect mentor. A convenient archetype that comforted us with the idea that a single man could indeed master the universe. And in his last and most ethereal metamorphosis, Leonardo became a ghost in the machine. In the digital universe of video games, his spectre was coded. He transformed into a secondary character, an ally who provides the player with clever gadgets and mechanical upgrades. His genius, now a programmed function. His inventions, a tool to advance in a mission. The man who dreamed of flying became the provider of a virtual hang glider. It is a strange form of immortality, to be reduced to a friendly algorithm, an echo of genius at the service of entertainment. In each of these versions, in every book, film, or line of code, a single question beats. Why him? Perhaps because Leonardo da Vinci is the brightest mirror of our own ambitions. In his figure, we see the unfulfilled dream of the unity of knowledge, the nostalgia for a world that we believed one man could understand in its entirety. We have turned him into a myth, not for what he was, but for what we long to be. We have dressed him in the robes of a wizard, a detective, a superhero, because it is difficult for us to accept the deepest and most human truth, that he was simply a man of infinite curiosity, who looked at the world with an attention that few have matched. These layers of legend, accumulated over centuries, act as a varnish that protects and at the same time obscures the original work. They have delivered to us a Leonardo larger than life, more exciting, more mysterious. But under the weight of these countless stories, under the dust of the myths that we ourselves have raised, the question remains, suspended in the air like a speck of dust in a sunbeam. Where does the reflection end and where does the stone begin? And so, the figure of man has dissolved into the echo of his own name. We have seen how his face multiplies in the infinite mirror of modern culture, how his genius becomes a code, a mystery of a novel, the protagonist of a spectacle he never sought. But now, in the twilight of our narration, we must pause. We must let the fog of the spectacle settle and walk carefully along the path that separates man from monument, truth from legend. It is a path eroded by time, covered by the moss of admiration and the weeds of fantasy. The construction of the myth began early, almost with the last breath of the master. It was Giorgio Vasari, the great chronicler of the Renaissance, who laid the first stones of this legendary temple. In his writings, Leonardo is not just an artist, he is a being of divine beauty, of superhuman strength, a personification of grace. Vasari tells us, with the solemnity of an evangelist, that King Francis I held Leonardo's head in his arms as he expired, weeping for the loss of the wisest man the world had ever known. It is a powerful image, a scene too perfect to be true, for records suggest that the king was elsewhere that day in May. But it was not a deception, but an act of devotion. It was the human need to give a worthy ending to an epic to the man who had painted like an angel and thought like a philosopher. The myth grew in the silence of the centuries, fed by the disorder and dispersion of his legacy. His notebooks, those thousands of pages that were the true map of his mind, were not an orderly testament, but an underground river of ideas, sketches, and doubts. They scattered like seeds in the wind after his death. Some fell into the hands of scholars, others were lost in the dust of forgotten libraries. This chaos, this fragmentation, created a void, and nature, as Leonardo himself observed, abhors a void. In those blank spaces, imagination sowed its own stories. He was spoken of as the inventor of machines that only the 20th century would make a reality: the tank, the helicopter, the submarine. And it is true, the drawings exist, whispers of possibility in sepia ink. But they were not engineering plans, but dreams of a visionary. They were the expression of a mind that wondered, what if? Reality is more subtle and perhaps more impressive. Leonardo was not a time traveler who brought with him the technology of the future. He was a man of his time who pushed its boundaries to the limit, using only observation, analogy, and a curiosity that knew no rest. The myth turns him into a magician. Reality reveals him as the supreme observer. Over time, his figure was claimed by secret lineages and esoteric societies. His mirror writing was interpreted as the key to hidden knowledge, not as the practical solution of a left-handed person to avoid smudging the ink. His symbols, like the Vitruvian Man, became maps of a mystical cosmology, forgetting that they were born from an almost clinical obsession with proportion and anatomy. The myth is seductive because it offers simple answers to complex questions. It offers a code to decipher, a conspiracy to unveil. Reality, on the other hand, offers us something more difficult and valuable: the example of a life dedicated to the incessant question. Separating reality from myth is not an act of demolition, but of restoration. It is carefully removing the ivy that, although beautiful, threatens to crumble the stone of the building. In doing so, we do not find an infallible demigod, but a human being with a moving depth. We find the man who left the adoration of the Magi as a ghost of ink and wood, perhaps overwhelmed by the vastness of his own vision. We find the scientist who dissected corpses by candlelight, battling against the stench and the taboo. driven not by glory, but by the pure desire to understand the mechanism of an eyelid or the flow of blood. The weight of genius is not omnipotence, but the awareness of all that remains to be done, the weariness of a mind that never sleeps. The myth speaks to us of a giant. Reality shows us a man who taught us to see. And when we look closely, we see that his true legacy is not encrypted in a secret code. It is in plain sight. In the geology of the rocks behind the Virgin, in the turbulence of the water he drew 1,000 times, in the silence that inhabits the hall of the Last Supper. When the noise of legends fades and the mist dissipates, what remains is not the echo of a giant, but the silent light of a star, which has guided navigators of art and science for 500 winters. And it is that light, constant and serene, that still illuminates our path. The fog slowly rises from the Loire, like a pale shroud that gradually reveals the towers of the castle of Amboise. 500 winters have polished the stone since the last breath of Leonardo left his body in a room of this place. The man is gone. The warmth of his skin, the doubt in his gaze, the weariness of his hands stained with pigment and earth, all of it is now ash carried by the wind, indistinguishable from the dust of the roads he travelled so much. And yet, something remains, something denser than memory and more persistent than stone. Because Leonardo's legacy is not a funerary monument, an object that is visited and forgotten. It is an underground current that emerged to change the course of the river of history. His life did not conclude in 1519, it simply transformed. He ceased to be a man to become a way of looking at the world. His death was not an end, but a sowing. His codices, scattered like seeds throughout Europe, would take centuries to fully germinate, each page a testament to a curiosity that knew no boundaries. In art, his heritage is that of eloquent silence. He left us the smile of a Florentine woman that contains all the secrets of the human soul, a grimace suspended between joy and melancholy that continues to question us from the other side of time. He bequeathed to us the drama suspended in the air of a Last Supper, where the echo of an announced betrayal still resonates in the stillness of the petrified apostles. He did not teach us to paint objects, but the air that surrounds them, the light that bathes them, the thought that animates them. The sfumato was not a technique, it was a philosophy, the acceptance that in life, as in art, the outlines are never entirely clear. In science, his lineage is not of blood, but of questions. In an era that sought answers in ancient texts, he sought them in the flight of a bird, in the flow of water, in the latent heart of a corpse dissected in the cold of a clandestine night. He did not publish his findings. He did not seek the applause of the academies. His dialogue was with nature itself, an intimate whisper between his mind and the universe. Each drawing of a gear, of a fetus in the womb, of a whirlpool in a river, was a syllable in his attempt to decipher the secret grammar of the world. He was the man who dreamed of flying 400 years before the sky was conquered, the one who mapped the human body as if it were a new continent. But his deepest legacy, the echo that resonates most strongly in our time, is the union of these two worlds. Leonardo showed us that there is no real boundary between art and science. Both are daughters of the same mother, attentive and wondrous observation. He taught us that the beauty of a lily and the mechanics of a lever arise from the same universal logic. In his mind, the poetry of a curve and the precision of an equation were not opposites, but two languages to describe the same truth. The tide of time erases the names of kings and the borders of empires. Great battles become footnotes, and the clamor of the crowds fades until it becomes a silence of moss upon the stone. But the vision of a single man, the tireless question of a mind that was never satisfied, can filter into the rocky bed upon which our world rests. Today, his heritage lives not only in museums or in history books. It lives in the spirit of the engineer who designs with elegance, of the doctor who sees the patient as a complete human being and not just as a set of symptoms, of the artist who studies anatomy to bring life to his creation. His work is not a full stop, but a perpetual invitation to look at the world with wonder, to connect the seemingly unconnected, to never stop questioning. The man from Vinci, the illegitimate son of a village notary, is gone, but his gaze endures, and in the silence of a library, or in the stillness of a gallery, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echo of his guiding principle, the key to his universe, the greatest lesson he left us. Saper videre, to know how to see.